You've seen it hundreds of times. Noble knights shining steel, rushing to the attack under fluttering banners. Heroic duels where honor and courage decide the outcome of the battle. Hollywood has painted us a vivid, exciting picture of medieval warfare. But what if I told you that most of it is just a beautiful fairy tale? Forget glitz and romance. Today we're going to plunge into the chilling reality of medieval battle in England, where not honor and glory ruled, but filth, fear, hunger, and unbearable cruelty. Ready to find out what was really behind the clang of swords and the glitter of cinematic armor? Imagine not a knight from a ballad, but an ordinary warrior shackled in iron. His armor is not a work of art, but a necessity of life, often crude and incredibly uncomfortable. The full-face armor, the dream of any warrior and a symbol of his status, weighed from 20 to 30 kilograms and sometimes much more, turning its wearer into the likeness of a clumsy metal sculpture, limiting mobility and endurance to the limit. These kilograms pressed on the shoulders and back, causing rapid fatigue even before the battle itself, restraining every movement. Try to move actively in such clothes, swinging a sword or axe for at least half an hour, not to mention many hours of battle. This test of endurance took place under the scorching sun, which heated the metal to scalding temperatures, or on the contrary, the freezing rain, which froze the joints, which aggravated the already difficult situation of the warrior. Under armor clothing, such as a gambeson or accaton, made of many layers of quilted linen or wool, although its softened blows and friction contributed to overheating and profuse perspiration, quickly becoming wet and heavy. The chainmail, more common among common soldiers and mercenaries due to its relative cheapness and ease of mass production, weighed about 10 to 15 pounds. It was not bad against the chopping blows of swords, but arrows with certain tips, fired at close range from a powerful English longbow, or a precise and strong jab with a spear could penetrate it, tearing rings and embedding into the body. Besides, it did not save at all from the crushing action of sticks, warhammers, and morgensterns, which broke bones and damaged internal organs even through steel rings. Now add to this the weight of the helmet, which often severely restricted vision, turning the field of view into a narrow slit, and made it difficult to breathe, muffling the sounds of battle, making it difficult to react in time to commands or threats. The massive wooden or metal shield the warrior held on his left arm weighed several more pounds, pulling off his shoulder and requiring constant muscle strain. A sword, axe, or other major weapon also added to the total burden, requiring considerable strength to wield effectively. The total weight of all the equipment could easily reach a third or even half of the warrior's own weight, making him a slow and sluggish target, especially on rough or viscous terrain. The cost of such equipment was enormous, making quality armor the privilege of a very narrow stratum of society. A good full-face armor, made by a famous master, could cost as much as a small village with all its inhabitants and livestock, or the annual income of a noble baron, or even several years of income of a simple knight. Therefore, most soldiers, especially those of the peasant militia, the so-called fyrd, or hastily recruited townspeople, were much less well protected. At best, they wore quilted gambesons, leather jackets, perhaps reinforced with stitched metal plates or chainmail inserts, and the simplest open helmets like the chapel, helmet hat, or the old Norman helmets. And yes, the armor rusted constantly, requiring daily and painstaking maintenance, which was no easy task in the field conditions of a military campaign. It was not the shiny, mirror-polished steel of modern movies, but rather dull, often stained and dented metal. Constant maintenance, which included cleaning with sand, ashes, vinegar, and then oiling with grease or oil, was absolutely essential to prevent ruinous corrosion, especially in the damp and wet climate of England. Otherwise, the faithful defense very quickly fell into disrepair, covered with a layer of rust, which weakened the metal and could lead to jamming of the moving parts of the lats. Even the best lats had vulnerabilities. The joints of the plates around the armpits, elbows, knees, and groin were traditionally weak points where experienced opponents would seek to strike, using specialized weapons like dagger rondelles or narrow swords-stocks. In addition, breathing in a closed helmet was difficult and visibility was extremely limited, which created blind spots and made the warrior dependent on his comrades nearby. Falling from a horse in full armor, especially in mud or water, often meant certain death, as it was extremely difficult and sometimes impossible to get up on one's own without help. The process of putting on full armor was a long and complicated affair, requiring the help of at least one or even two squires, who tightened numerous straps and buckles in a certain sequence. The common warrior, of course, had no such luxury, and his equipment was easier to handle. The constant wearing of heavy armor led to chronic back and joint pain, abrasions, and even bone deformities, leaving its imprint on the rest of his life, if the warrior managed to live it. The sound of a moving army clad in metal could be heard from afar. It was a continuous clanking, rattling, and creaking of thousands of metal parts, demasking the army and pressing on the nerves before the battle. The idea that all soldiers went into battle with a fiery heart and joy for their king and native England is another common myth, far from the harsh truth. The basis of medieval armies in England for many centuries remained the feudal conscription system based on landholdings and vassal oaths of allegiance. This system obliged large landowners, barons and knights, to field a certain number of soldiers, fully equipped and ready for service at their own expense. Vassals were legally obliged to serve their immediate liege lord, and through him, the king, for a certain number of days per year, usually a period of 40 days, known as quarantine. However, for long military campaigns, such as the conquest in Wales, Scotland, or the disastrous expeditions to France during the 100 Years' War, this time was disastrously short. In addition, feudal militia were often poorly trained and reluctant to fight away from their homes, forcing kings to seek other sources of troop replenishment. Therefore, English kings and major feudal lords actively resorted to hiring professional soldiers, both at home and abroad. Mercenaries, or soldiers of fortune, who came from Flanders, Gascony, Germany, and other European regions, fought exclusively for monetary reward, and their loyalty often depended directly on the timeliness and completeness of this payment. It was not uncommon for mercenary units to plunder or even defect to the enemy if the latter offered better conditions. For the common peasant, yeoman, or townsman, conscription through the so-called commissions of array, which authorized local nobles to select eligible men, most often meant a complete break from the household. This could lead to the decline of a farm or craft shop and, as a consequence, to a real threat of starvation for the family left without a breadwinner. The likelihood of not returning home from such a journey, killed by sword, arrow, disease, or starvation, was extremely high, which of course did not add to the enthusiasm and willingness to serve. The motivation for going to war was quite different and depended on social status and personal circumstances. For a member of the knightly class, especially for the younger sons who did not have large landholdings, war was a chance to become famous, to earn new land grants from the king or his lord, or to receive a significant ransom for a captured noble enemy. For the professional mercenary whose trade was warfare, it was first and foremost a livelihood, a way to feed himself and his family, and an opportunity to enrich himself with booty. For the common militiaman, forcibly torn from the plow or workbench, the motivation was most often fear of severe punishment for evading royal service or failing to show up at the muster station. Punishments could range from heavy fines to imprisonment or even the death penalty. At best, and rarely enough, he could be beckoned by the vague and ghostly hope of capturing some valuable booty in the enemy's land. Wars were fought for the ambitions and interests of the nobility, but it was the commoners, whose own interests were rarely taken into account, who shed the bulk of their blood. Royal recruitment decrees were read out by heralds in market squares and at church gates, calling on all men capable of bearing arms to report for service under penalty of severe penalties. There was also a system of sponsorship, where a community or village was obliged to put up a certain number of recruits and guarantee their attendance. It was not uncommon for wealthier people to buy off the service by hiring substitutes, replacement fighters, in their place, further emphasizing the reluctance of many to personally participate in the aristocracy's bloody pastimes. The consequences of desertion could be severe, up to and including confiscation of property and outlawry, effectively condemning a person to a life of pariah. However, desertion, especially during protracted and unsuccessful campaigns, was quite common, despite all the threats. Soldiers exhausted by hunger, disease, and lack of pay simply scattered, trying to return home or join bands of brigands. Controlling huge masses of poorly organized men in medieval logistics and communications was incredibly difficult, and commanders often had to turn a blind eye to minor transgressions to avoid losing the remnants of their troops. The notion of a medieval army marching briskly and orderly to a future battlefield also bears little resemblance to reality. Moving an army in those days was an incredibly slow, grueling, and torturous process for everyone involved, from the common archer to the noble knight, even if the latter rode on horseback. The day's passage rarely exceeded 15 or 20 miles, and often was even less, especially if the army was large and laden with supplies. The roads, if they could be called so at all, outside the ancient Roman tracks, which by that time had already become very dilapidated, after the first serious rain turned into an impenetrable mess of mud and clay. The soldiers walked most of the way on foot, drowning ankle-deep, or even knee-deep, in this viscous slurry, carrying not only some of their heavy equipment, but also a meager supply of provisions, which was fast running out. The wheels of the sluggish wagons of the party were constantly stuck, requiring tremendous efforts of men and draft animals to pull them out. Logistics and supply were a nightmare for any commander, even the most experienced and prudent. Providing food for the huge mass of men, armies could number in the tens of thousands, and the numerous horses needed for knights, carriages, and artillery, in the almost total absence of normal lines of communication and specialized transport, was a daunting task. The army often had to feed itself at the expense of the local population, which had far-reaching and extremely negative consequences. Centralized supplies were rare and mainly concerned grain or wine for the nobility. This meant requisitions which quickly escalated into outright looting on enemy territory, and often to the despair of the locals on their own, which provoked fierce hatred and resistance on the part of peasants and townspeople. Hunger was the almost constant companion of the common soldier throughout the campaign, weakening his body and spirit and making him more susceptible to disease. Soldiers ate whatever they could find: unripe fruit, roots, and sometimes carrion, which only exacerbated their digestive problems. But even worse than hunger and physical fatigue were the diseases that spread at a terrifying rate in the unsanitary conditions of the marching camp. The crowding of thousands of people and animals in a limited space, the complete lack of basic hygiene, the absence of normal toilets and waste disposal systems, the consumption of contaminated water from rivers, lakes, and random wells, all this inevitably led to mass epidemics and outbreaks of infectious diseases. Primitive ideas about the causes of diseases did not allow to fight them effectively. Dysentery, called bloody diarrhea or camp disease, typhus, known as prison fever, scurvy due to a catastrophic lack of vitamin C in a monotonous diet consisting mainly of bread and corned beef. These diseases mowed down soldiers by the thousands. Sometimes they claimed far more lives than the swords and arrows of the enemy, turning entire armies into crowds of emaciated cripples. An army could lose much of its fighting capacity before it even fought its first serious battle, and many campaigns failed because of epidemics. River crossings presented a separate difficulty. Bridges were few and often destroyed by the retreating enemy or rendered unusable by time. It was necessary to search for fords, which were not always safe, or to build temporary pontoon bridges, which took precious time and effort. The huge wagon that followed the army included not only provisions and forage, but also tents for the nobility, blacksmithing equipment to repair weapons and armor, carpentry tools, and even marching chapels, stretching for miles and slowing the pace of travel to a snail's pace. Nightlife in the camp was full of anxieties. The constant need to post sentries to guard against surprise attacks by the enemy or desperate locals, the fear of wild animals, and internal conflicts and fights between soldiers, often arising from the sharing of booty or national differences in multilingual mercenary armies. Water quality was a critical factor, and often the only available source was polluted rivers or ponds, where sewage from the camp itself flowed, creating ideal conditions for the spread of intestinal infections. The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables for weeks and months led to bleeding gums, loose teeth and ulcers on the skin, clear signs of scurvy. Forget about the beautiful and staged shots from movies, where armies in splendor, like on parade, rows converge in a deadly attack. The real battlefield in the Middle Ages is first and foremost indescribable chaos, noise, confusion, and animal fear, mixed with rage. Yes, there were certainly certain tactical formations and techniques. The famous English wall of shields, consisting of tightly closed rows of infantry or deadly volleys of English longbows, capable of thinning the ranks of the advancing enemy. But as soon as hand-to-hand combat began, any formation was quickly broken. Communication between the various parts of the army was extremely primitive and unreliable. Messengers on horseback who could be killed, signal flags that could not be seen well in the dust and smoke, or the sound of battle horns and trumpets. In the deafening din of battle, commands were often not heard or reached the commanders with considerable delay. As a result, the battle quickly disintegrated into many separate, localized skirmishes and duels, where each warrior fought primarily for his own life. The overall tactical battle plan, if it existed in the commander's mind, almost instantly lost all relevance and meaning. Panic could sweep an entire flank or troop because of an occasional unfavorable rumor, the death of a prominent commander, or an unexpected enemy maneuver. The English archers, armed with their powerful longbows, were indeed a formidable force on the battlefield. Their arrows, fired at high velocity and frequency, had enough killing power to pierce chainmail and even some pieces of armor at a certain distance. They caused confusion and death in the enemy ranks before the main engagement began, but the archers themselves were vulnerable to cavalry attacks or return fire. No modern movie, even with the most sophisticated sound system, can ever fully convey the cacophony that reigned on a medieval battlefield. Imagine the deafening, incessant noise that made your ears ache and your mind boggle. It was not only the clang of steel against steel, the deafening clang of swords and axes against shields. It was, above all, the battle cries of 1,000 throats, the fierce roar of the attackers, the heart-rending cries of pain and terror of the wounded, the death rattle of the dying. All this merged into a single monstrous rumble. To this was added the roaring of horses maddened by fear and wounds, the shrill sounds of battle trumpets and drums, which tried to bring some element of order and control into this bloody chaos, but more often only increased the general confusion and panic. And the odors, that's a separate, equally horrifying side of reality. The heavy, cloying smell of fresh blood mixed with the acrid odor of sweat, dirt, human and horse feces. Because in the heat of battle and from the overwhelming animal terror, many warriors simply did not control their natural needs. Add to this the odor of metal burning in the sun or on fire, the acrid smoke from the then rare primitive gunpowder weapons or from the occasional set fire to buildings and wagons. All these odors mingled into a single, nauseating, suffocating stench that haunted those lucky enough to survive for a long time. It was a true sensory overload, capable of driving even the most resilient person insane. Warriors often fought in a state of near combat trance or affect, stunned, blinded, and disoriented. These sounds and smells are forever etched in the memories of those who have been through this scorcher. Getting seriously wounded in a medieval battle was almost as frightening as finding a quick death on the spot. The level of medicine in those times was in its infancy, one might say barbaric. There were very few qualified surgeons. They were often barbers who, in addition to cutting and shaving, were also engaged in bloodletting and tooth extraction, or simply people who had some practical experience in caring for the wounded. Their knowledge of anatomy and physiology was very limited, and their toolkit was primitive and intimidating. Anesthesia as such did not exist. Any complex surgical interventions, such as amputations of shattered limbs, if they were ever attempted, were performed alive. The warrior was given alcohol or poppy decoction to dull the pain, but it did little to help. The limb was sawed off with an ordinary saw, and the wound was cauterized with a red-hot iron to stop bleeding. The chances of surviving such a barbaric operation were slim because of painful shock, blood loss, and most importantly, subsequent infections. Antibiotics had not yet been invented, and any open wound, even if not too serious at first glance, could easily fester, leading to sepsis, gangrene, and a long, painful death. Penetrating wounds to the chest or abdomen were almost always a death sentence, even if vital internal organs were not directly hit by an enemy blade or arrow. Infection did its evil work within days or weeks. Only a few survived. Treatment was mostly limited to washing wounds with wine, vinegar, or even urine, which oddly enough, sometimes had some weak antiseptic effect due to its ammonia content. Primitive dressings with various herbs were applied to wounds, the efficacy of which was questionable. Mortality from wounds received in battle was monstrous. Let us try for a moment to imagine the battlefield through the eyes of an ordinary common infantryman. He may be a peasant recently torn from his field and plow, or a city artisan conscripted into the militia. He does not have the gleaming armor of a noble knight. At best, he wears a simple leather jacket, perhaps reinforced with metal plates, and a cheap iron helmet. His weapon is most likely a long spear, a simple axe, or a heavy club. He stands in a tight formation, shoulder to shoulder with men like him, deathly frightened. He sees before him an impenetrable wall of enemy shields, above which the points of spears and the blades of swords gleam. He hears the growing rumble of the approaching attack, the battle cries of the enemy, and the desperate cries of his comrades. His heart pounded frantically in his chest, pumping huge doses of adrenaline into his bloodstream. His vision is severely restricted by the bodies of the warriors standing next to him and the margins of his own helmet. He can only see what is happening directly in front of him and a few steps to the sides. Around him, wounded and dead comrades fall screaming, their blood splattering on his face and clothes. His main primary goal in this meat grinder is not abstract glory or performing heroic feats. His only real goal is to survive at all costs, to kill the enemy who is trying to kill him before he can deliver the fatal blow. Instincts override reason and judgment. In this bloodbath, in this hell on earth, there is no room for chivalry or the rules of fair combat. Blows are struck wherever they can, often sneakily in the back, at the already fallen and helpless. Wild animal fear mixed with primal rage and the desire to destroy the enemy. It is a struggle for life in its most unconcealed form. When the deafening shouts and clanking of weapons finally subsided, and one of the opposing sides turned to panic flight or was completely destroyed, the next, no less grim and brutal phase of medieval battle, its immediate aftermath, began. The victors, tired but excited by their success, began methodically combing the entire battlefield. Their main and primary goal was looting. From the bodies of the dead and still alive but badly wounded enemies, and sometimes even their fallen comrades, they took absolutely everything of any value. These were weapons, elements of armor, clothes, shoes, any personal belongings, money, jewelry. Wounded opponents were often killed without any pity, to make it easier for themselves and not to fear a stab in the back. Looting was not only a way to enrich oneself, but also to make up for one's own losses in equipment. The fate of captured warriors was quite different and depended on their social status. Noble knights and barons could count on being kept alive for a rich ransom. Capturing nobles was a lucrative business in the Middle Ages. They were kept in relatively tolerable conditions until their relatives collected the required sum. Common soldiers, militia, or mercenaries were most often either killed on the spot, especially if they were wounded and of no value as labor, or they could be enslaved, although this was less common in medieval England than, for example, in Eastern Europe or the Middle East. Sometimes they were simply released after being disarmed and stripped of their valuables. In the vast majority of cases, the bodies of the dead were buried rarely and in an extremely haphazard manner. Often they were simply left lying on the battlefield, where they became easy prey for flocks of crows, wolves, and other wild carrion animals. Brothers' graves, if they were dug, were shallow, dug in haste and without any rituals. We talk a lot about the physical horrors and hardships of medieval warfare, about injuries and death. However, we must not forget the deep psychological traumas that warriors who went through this scorcher inevitably suffered. The concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, did not exist in those times, of course. But this does not mean that veterans of medieval wars did not suffer from severe consequences of what they had seen, experienced, and done. Constant insomnia, haunting nightmares, sudden and uncontrollable fits of rage, or, on the contrary, deep apathy and detachment, obsessive and painful memories of battles. All this was undoubtedly familiar to many of them. How did they cope with these invisible but no less painful wounds of the soul? The society of the time offered its own specific ways of treatment and consolation. Religion played a huge paramount role in the life of medieval man. Prayers, confessions, pilgrimages to holy places, generous donations to the church. All these were seen as ways of cleansing from the sins committed in war and finding peace of mind. There were also various folk superstitions, magical rituals, and conspiracies that were used to get rid of the evil spirits of war. Some veterans tried to find oblivion in alcohol or gambling, while others sought to forget as soon as possible in hard work and everyday peaceful concerns, if they were lucky enough to return home unharmed. For many, however, the invisible scars of war remained an open wound for the rest of their lives. Stories and legends of mad or obsessed veterans who were unable to adapt to civilian life have survived to this day, reflecting the harsh reality. The psychological cost of war was as high as the physical, but it was just less talked about and even less understood. Medieval military campaigns were not always conducted exclusively in warm and favorable seasons. Very often the hostilities dragged on until deep fall and even severe winter. And then to the familiar horrors of battle and the hardships of marching life were added two more merciless and deadly enemies: bitter cold and all-pervasive hunger. Active combat in conditions of low temperatures, freezing winds, snowfall, and lack of basic food was a real severe test of survival for any troops, no matter how hardened they were. Soldiers suffered massively from frostbite, often resulting in the need for amputation or slow death from infection. Clothing, even if initially warm and durable, quickly became wet in the rain and snow, froze on the body, and had little chance of drying out in hiking conditions. The shelters from the weather, if they existed at all, were primitive tents or hastily constructed dugouts, which provided little protection from the cold. Fuel for fires was in great short supply, especially during long sieges. The army's fighting ability under such extreme conditions fell sharply and steadily. Men and horses without adequate food and warmth rapidly became weak, sick, and died from exhaustion, hypothermia, and related diseases such as pneumonia. Soldiers' morale dropped to critically low levels. Hunger in winter became even more acute and agonizing. It was almost impossible to get food by plundering in the war-torn territory, and the transportation of vital supplies by frozen rivers or snow-covered roads was almost completely cut off. The besieged cities and fortresses suffered particularly badly, and history knows cases when their defenders went as far as cannibalism. Cold and hunger could decide the outcome of an entire military campaign far more effectively than any bloody battle. They forced armies to retreat, suffering huge non-combat losses, or to capitulate in the face of imminent death from exhaustion and frost. Nature was often a more formidable foe than any human army. So, we looked behind the bright but deceptive screen of Hollywood blockbusters and tried to see the true, unvarnished face of medieval battle in England. It was far from the world of noble knights in shining armor and easily won glorious victories, as it is often portrayed to us. It was a cruel world where cold steel, sticky blood, impenetrable mud, overwhelming fear, grueling hunger, and bone-chilling cold ruled supreme. It was a world where every day was a desperate struggle for survival, and death was at every turn. And not only from the enemy's sword, spear, or arrow, but also from insidious diseases, from poorly healed wounds, from hunger, and from harsh weather conditions. Understanding this unsightly but harsh reality helps us not only to penetrate deeper and more meaningfully into the history of the Middle Ages, it also allows us to truly appreciate the incredible human fortitude, endurance, and the enormous, unthinkable price our distant ancestors paid for the very right to life, for their families and their land. It was an era of the hardest trials, where the strongest in spirit and body survived, and sometimes just those who had blind luck. I hope this dive into the past has been truly enlightening and thought-provoking for you. Medieval warfare is an incredibly huge, multifaceted, and complex subject, and today we have only touched lightly on its darkest and harshest aspects.